It's like being an environmental scientist. I'm exploring an environment, but it's a very big environment, and it goes through the whole universe. And we encounter very unusual places, and I'm interested in knowing all about them. I want to be first.
And Peter Goldreich has been the first to explain many mysteries of our universe since the early 1960s as a PhD student in physics at Cornell University and a postdoc at Cambridge University. But his modus operandus is not the mighty telescopes.
I'm not programming a computer. I'm not even writing very much with a pencil. I'm just thinking. I helped rejuvenate an ancient field of application of dynamics to the solar system, in particular to the motions over long times of the planets, their satellites, and also the spins of the planets.
An initial triumph, the role of resonances in the solar system.
In the time it takes Jupiter to go once around the sun, this asteroid goes exactly twice around the sun. So this is an example of exact resonance. My aim was to try to explain why there were quite a few satellite pairs around the two big outer planets, Jupiter and Saturn, which were in this form of resonance.
Goldreich concluded the satellites' interaction with the planets caused them to gain momentum, and as their orbits expanded, they maintained these resonance ratios.
This type of resonance was an important feature in the generation of volcanoes on the satellite Io.
But there's also the potential of chaos in this type of resonance system.
Chaos is a very common type of motion. In systems which have embedded in them somewhere in their dynamics a pendulum.
In the 1970s, Goldreich proposed that shepherding satellites keep Uranus' rings confined to a narrow arc against the disruptions of continual collisions of particles. A year later, this prediction was confirmed when the Voyager passed Saturn and found that it too had a narrow ring, the F ring, previously unknown.
And there, one on each side of it, were two new satellites, which were acting as shepherds for this ring.
Goldreich also predicted the satellites' motions could be chaotic. Indeed, it was found years later they've deviated from their orbits. A related proposal is that planets forming out of gas and dust in solar systems would interact in similar ways as satellites in planet ring systems, and thus
there could be rapid evolution in the orbits of new planets.
That greatly helped explain extrasolar planets when they were discovered.
Yeah, that was a very tremendous breakthrough.
I found California to be paradise, and I've never changed my mind about that.
Many of 68-year-old New York-born Professor Goldreich's breakthroughs were made in his 36 years at the California Institute of Technology, in planetary science and astronomy, and then in astrophysics and planetary physics.
You have to pick a problem which has some chance of you making a breakthrough in it. Then you have to have the idea. I enjoy just sitting there and thinking. I learned a lot from teaching, and I learned about waves in ponds and the way they were damped. That led me to the work I did on helioseismology and on the twinkling of radio stars. So I've had quite a few of my best ideas here. The idea of charges being ripped out of a neutron star.
Rotating neutron stars, also known as pulsars.
And then one day, I realized that the neutron star would have charges on its surface, and the electric field would change discontinuously from inside the neutron star to outside, and it would push these charges away with a tremendous acceleration. And this has become a standard picture of how pulsars function. Most of my work has very little practical influence. These are intellectual advances nature presents you with a puzzle. Why is the sun oscillating?
At first, Goldreich ignored that puzzle until another scientist made some claims. Goldreich countered them.
The reason it was oscillating was because these gases were boiling and it was rattling the pot. And we made an estimate of the magnitude of the rattling. And we said this is much, much less than the scientists who said the diameter was changing could account for.
You really have picked up the biggest, deepest thinker in astrophysics these days. He really has tremendous physical intuition, but every few years he's picking up on a new interesting problem and makes a home run.
Yeah.
Hi.
Goldreich and Hong Kong-born Caltech professor Yuk Jung have been colleagues for some 35 years.
He has extremely high skills in human relations, in institute matters, in matters related to the society. Maybe once a year, I will ask him difficult questions which I have trouble making decisions, and he will always be able to help me out.
The two colleagues share another passion.
There's no question that he has extremely fine taste for the good Chinese food.
When I first started to do science, I wasn't really sure that I wanted to continue to do that for a career. But after I made a few discoveries, I got a taste for it. Just like a tiger who eats a human. It tasted better and better each time. And each time you have a success, you want more. You never can get enough.
He was already well famous by the time he finished his thesis project. The net result is that he quickly became a professor. In addition to being a great scientist, is a wise man. There's no sense that he is smarter than other people.
And Goldreich claims he was no child prodigy.
I was just a reasonably normal boy. I was mostly interested in sports. And then after a while I was interested in girls. But I wasn't very interested in school.
Yeah, this is typical. Sometimes even when we have people...
Peter, nearly 17 years old, met Susan in 1956 at the University of Colorado, where his school teacher parents were attending summer school.
De la Navidad.
We started to play ping pong together, which we still do now, and we also studied Spanish together.
De certeza.
Was it love at first sight?
Well, it was something related to it, at least.
It was attraction. We were our first serious boyfriend and girlfriend. I liked him because he was smart, athletic, and he was kind of bossy. And at that time, I was very wimpy.
They were married 4 years later.
He thought a lot. I help him by taking away all the mundane tasks of life that...
Do you understand what he does?
Not really, but he washes the dishes every night. And sometimes we make salads together.
The couple has 2 sons.
It was very different than any other family because no one could understand what my dad did for a living. He worked all the time. He'd wake up and work. I fell asleep, he'd still be working. And he would be walking in the mountains and I would be complaining about my feet hurting. And he would be lost in thought solving some problem.
But he always takes time with his grandson to try and inspire him to be a better academic student.
He also spent a lot of time between thinking about astrophysics, doing sports with our kids when they were growing up.
Peter does a wide range of sports, including being a judo black belt.
I do sports just like I do science. A little bit of this, a little bit of that. It's my psychology. I get bored if I do the same thing too long. There's some intellectual component. There's enough time in tennis to decide consciously what you're going to do when the ball is coming towards you.
Since 2003, Goldreich has been a professor at the Princeton Institute of Advanced Study, but he continues to work with Caltech colleagues.
One is some understanding of formation of planets and understanding of the structure of our own outer solar system. Another thing we are interested in pursuing is understanding the mechanics of small bodies in the vicinity of the Earth, so-called near-Earth asteroids.
Hi,
Peter, how are you?
Beneath the brains and the brawn is apparently a heart of gold.
He wants to solve a lot of mystery that nature have give to us. He also inspire a lot of young people to want to solve those kind of problems. It's sort of like my father, my grandfather kind of figure for me. So yeah, so I like to talk with him about everything in life and also in science.
I don't like to work in things where many people are working. I don't want to do detail, and I want to do it in things that involve physics, and I want there to be a little magic in it.
'64-year-old Dr. Bob Lefkowitz came to North Carolina in 1973. A cardiologist and researcher, Turbo Bob, as he's sometimes known, charged ahead during earlier stints at the National Institutes of Health and a Harvard-related hospital in the study of cellular receptors for adrenaline and related molecules. Research he has continued at Duke University ever since. Receptors are found in cell membrane. They're like a lock.
And the adrenaline or other hormone is like a key, which has to fit in perfectly into that lock and leads to a signal going into the cell, which is then able to change the physiology of the cell.
For example, in a frightening situation, the brain would signal for the secretion of adrenaline in the blood. And it interacts with an adrenergic receptor in a cell membrane.
If this were a heart cell, the cell would beat more strongly and more rapidly.
In their cells, airways would dilate, both responses allowing the person greater capacity to run away. At Duke University Medical School, Lefkowitz worked as a cardiologist in the wards and clinics, as well as did his research. By 1976, he became an investigator for the prestigious Howard Hughes Medical Institute, which has funded his research to this day.
When I started my research, nothing was known about the presumed interaction of hormones and drugs and neurotransmitters with these mythical receptors. And there was tremendous skepticism at that time as to whether these things existed.
So Lefkowitz and colleagues set out to prove they do. They used as a model beta-adrenergic receptors for adrenaline, developing new technologies in the process.
We developed what are called radioligands.
Radially active labeled molecules like adrenaline, which would bind to their receptors. And to remove them, the fatty cell membrane was dissolved in detergent. All that took a dozen years.
The receptors are very rare. Perhaps 1 in 200,000 or 300,000 molecules in the cell membrane would actually be the receptor we were interested in. So we used very specific tools to do that.
To prove the molecules were indeed adrenaline receptors, they made liquid vesicles much like a child's soap bubbles and stuck the receptors into them. Then they found a cell which didn't have any receptors for adrenaline and fused the vesicles to it.
The cell was able to bind the adrenaline. Once we had done this, we proved that receptors really did exist.
Then, working with tiny quantities of purified adrenaline receptors, Bob and company were able, in 1986, to clone the receptor gene and decipher its amino acid sequence.
And that was one of our biggest discoveries, because we found that the receptor protein wove back and forth across the plasma membrane 7 times. We speculated that perhaps many different receptors might have the same structure and share the characteristic that they signal through another protein called a G protein.
In the ensuing decade, Bob and his team and other scientists using their methods found over 1,000 different 7-membrane spanning receptors, including those for taste, smell, and sight, the largest receptor family by far.
So really, most of our sensory system works through these receptors. So gentlemen, good afternoon.
60% of all drugs in current use now work by acting upon the class of receptors that Dr. Lefkowitz studied. So this work is at the very top.
These drugs can either be agonists, for example, histamine released by an allergic reaction into the bloodstream and binding to receptors causing hives, or antagonists, such as an antihistamine drug, which can prevent histamine from binding and thus blocks the allergic reaction.
Is that the techniques that we've developed have permitted much more rapid development of drugs. The drug companies can basically use cell lines which express the individual receptors and very rapidly screen even millions of compounds for specific effects on receptors. The second way is that our work led to the discovery of dozens and dozens of what are called receptor subtypes.
For example, there are 9 subtypes of receptors for adrenaline and 15 for serotonin.
It's possible to design drugs which are much more specific for one or the other receptor subtype. So there'll be less side effects.
The kind of detailed work he's done over years made him so distinctive and distinguished.
It's focus and perseverance.
Another vital discovery was that when stimulants bind to receptors, the responding signaling through G proteins rises and then falls in seconds to minutes.
This desensitization phenomenon greatly limits the therapeutic efficacy of many stimulant drugs.
Bob found the cause. An enzyme called GRK transfers a phosphate group onto the tail of the 7-transmembrane receptor, and another protein called berestin then binds to it to desensitize G protein signals.
It's only really in the last few years that these really remarkable fluorescent microscopic assays have been developed that have allowed us to use the microscope. So when I was at the bench myself using more biochemical techniques and working, with test tubes.
In the past 5 years, Lefkowitz had another unexpected breakthrough.
This 2-component system of GRK enzyme and beta-arrestin also leads to new signaling to other pathways, some of which is enhanced cell survival, decreased cell death. This will represent an entirely new form of therapeutic agent, which may be more effective than the drugs we have today.
For example, a patient with coronary artery problems, mostly due to excessive adrenaline stimulation, can be given a drug that both stops the harmful effect of adrenaline and protects heart cells from dying.
Bob Lefkowitz, without question, is one of the greatest scientists of our times.
One of the brightest minds in the world.
Bob is very energetic, and he has magical ways to motivate his associates to do science in an unconventional way, and very creative, and also very focused. And meanwhile, he always helps us to develop leadership in science.
Wei Chen is one of over 200 scientists mentored by Lefkowitz, for which Bob won the Eugene Brownwald Award last year. He says it's his favorite among his numerous prizes.
I really do view my own primary activity as just interacting with the students and fellows, trying to model for them what a career in science is like. So I would like them to take away certain principles that I have sort of used. One of the most important ones is that if you want to get an important answer in science, you have to ask an important question, which is answerable by you.
But it wasn't always easy.
No matter how successful you are, 98% of what you do doesn't work. I must admit, when I was doing most of my own experiments, I would get very, very frustrated, and it was very, very difficult to deal with. But I think one just has to keep one's eye on the long-term goal. Persistence, absolute dogged persistence. is one of the most important characteristics of a successful scientist.
The other thing he brings is great energy and good humor.
A great sense of optimism and courage.
Bob's a lifelong runner. 16 years ago, through his hobby, Bob met his second wife, Lynn.
I was working at Duke as an administrative secretary, and at the time I was jogging and running too. Somehow we just started running together and became friends, and then became husband and wife. He's just so much fun to be with. I mean, he has the most wonderful sense of humor. He's so witty and has such an upbeat personality.
Bob has 5 grown children by his first wife and 4 grandchildren. Lynn says the couple do discuss Bob's work.
I can't say I really fully understand everything he does, and I appreciate because he shares with me his troubles and his frustrations, and tells me about the successes.
In terms of the specifics, I'm glad that she's not particularly interested, and I'm glad to get away from talking about that.
On a typical day,
when I come home, I'm ravenously hungry. But Lynn is a fabulous cook, and we're both vegetarians.
Because I've just always had a lot of compassion for animals.
It's because I have a very strong family history of heart disease in both my parents.
That's one reason Lefkowitz went to study medicine at Columbia University.
I lived in New York City, and my family physician actually made house calls. By the 3rd grade of elementary school, I had pretty much decided I wanted to be a practicing physician, and in particular as a cardiologist.
And after dinner?
He works, sit on papers and things all evening. My sense is he thinks about science, about ideas and projects and plans for the future and experiments almost all the time.
But I guess we love to travel together too.
Mm-hmm.
And
just relax and read and
just hang out together.
Yeah.
We like watching old movies. Whatever it is, I mean, I either do it or I don't do it. But if I'm doing it,
he's all in.
All in, right.
There are 2 things that I found are essential to a mathematician, namely a willingness to be alone and a willingness to work.
Yeah.
Professor Robert Langlands, aged 71, honed those skills sawing log as a child in his native British Columbia, Canada.
I come from many generations of carpenters. For a mathematician, I'm not a bad carpenter, and for a carpenter, I'm not a bad mathematician.
And Robert might have become career-wise a chip off the old block, but for a book at age 15 from his future wife Charlotte's father.
Freud, Marx, Einstein, Hutton was there, and I think when I read that book, that was when I first had the idea that there were thinkers in the world. It impressed me a great deal. And that probably influenced my choice of being a mathematician. Now we can go straight across the lake.
At 16, just before graduating from high school, Robert embarked on a new course when an English teacher persuaded him to go to university.
It made all the difference to my life.
At the University of British Columbia, he showed aptitude for maths.
Given the nature of what I'd done in high school, namely nothing, the only place where I could think was mathematics, think without any experience, without any knowledge. I always had a strong streak of ambition. I transferred all of the ambition to mathematics.
Langlands got his PhD from Yale in 1960 and by 1972 was made a professor at the Princeton Institute of Advanced Study. He retired this July.
Really grand ideas that had developed out of simple numbers, those are the things that fascinated me. There is great movement in the burgeoning of algebraic number theory throughout the whole of the 19th century and even into this century. It's called the Quadratic Reciprocity Law. Let's consider today just 2 numbers, 3 and 5, both prime numbers.
A prime number is one in which no number will divide into it without a remainder except 1 and the number itself.
So 3 is not a quadratic residue of 5. 5 is not a quadratic residue of 3. So there's the reciprocity. You could take any two prime numbers and you could ask, is P a quadratic residue of Q, and if Q is a quadratic residue of P, and what's the relation between the answer in the two cases?
19th century mathematician Adrien Marie Legendre conjectured the relation. Carl Friedrich Gauss proved it. Then Norwegian mathematician Niels Henrik Abel created a class field theory for algebraic numbers, but his only applied to numbers of degree 2.
And was there a theory that would apply to an equation which was of degree 3, or an equation of degree 4, or an equation of degree, well, other higher degrees? General form of class field theory was absent, and I at least felt very strongly that wanted very much to find it.
In the mid-1960s, Langlands proposed that a solution to a general class field theory could lie in automorphic forms, symmetries closely related to those of Escher's famous hyperbolic drawings, and to what he calls L functions.
L functions are closely related to prime numbers and are at the same time functions of a complex variable which is usually called Z.
Langlands' conjecture would also allow him to establish basic properties of L functions.
I was quite excited. To this day, I find it very beautiful. I finally gave it the name, the functoriality. Having formulated functoriality, one of my first concerns was to persuade myself that it was a reasonable statement, that I could prove what it implied and I could make some progress.
Langlands looked to the Taniyama-Shimura conjecture relating equations for elliptical curves to those for modular forms, and he envisaged
it may be the case that for any curve, any surface, or even higher dimensional object defined by equations with, say, rational coefficients, where I could find an automorphic form.
One breakthrough came in 1976 as Langlands was sitting and thinking at his log cabin at Lac Gustave. The result is what Langlands calls base change.
Base change says you can change fields.
If you have an equation with coefficients that are ordinary fractions, you might want to study them in a context with more coefficients.
And that's a very important principle in mathematics because it allows you to take one situation which may be difficult and render it more simple, but you can only do that on the side of equations. Base change theorem was a theorem that allowed you to do it also on the side of L functions.
An unexpected boon was base change turned out to be essential to Andrew Wiles' proof of Fermat's last theorem.
That surprised me. That I hadn't expected a connection. But for me, it was a very important step along the way.
Robert's work has been loosely called Langlands' program.
That is not entirely clear to me. All right? And I don't think it's entirely clear to the people who use the word.
Some have described it as a grand scheme of unification, bridging all the main math topics. On one side are geometric theories.
The first one is automorphic forms. This would include this general question of functoriality. The other side is either number theoretic or geometric, the analysis of surfaces and curves and higher dimensional objects defined by polynomial equations. I've spent a good deal of time over the past 40 years trying to find what would be analytic methods.
Years with his wife by his side, Robert, aged 14, met Charlotte Chevary, 16, at a high school dance in White Rock, British Columbia.
That evening, she had on a red jacket.
Very flattering, don't you think?
He was just the smartest boy in the school.
I was also a very handsome young man. You might not believe it now.
Oh, no,
but
he was, yeah.
Even though
Often his mind is elsewhere.
They married in 1956. They have 4 children and several grandkids.
She now knows the duties of a lady, and she's willing to give her grandfather a kiss on the cheek in spite of his beard.
So long hours away.
From home.
I would work at the university in my office. Here I would work outside.
How was it like growing up with Dad?
A trial. She's going to say a trial, but she doesn't dare.
And he didn't really participate in family life because he was working. I knew he was a mathematician. I mean, yeah, I understood the basic concept.
It's fair to say that I understand his needs as a mathematician.
Oh, what kind of needs?
Time, patience.
My wife was very capable. She's very fond of children, and she was very patient with me.
Charlotte took up sculpting in her mid-40s, working on clay and now stone.
If she did your portrait, I mean, it would look exactly like you, and in clay, say. So that was, I thought, a very peculiar talent to manifest itself just out of the blue.
We moved around a lot, and that was hard. From the time I was about 7 on, we would return to the house in Princeton. But after that, we were gone. We were 6 months in Montreal, Germany, France, in Turkey for a year.
That was 1967, soon after Robert, as associate professor at Princeton University, sketched out the Langlands program.
I needed a change. I was asking myself to perform at a rather high level, and I think I simply exhausted myself. So I was just going to be someplace else in an exotic atmosphere, and where there was no mathematics.
But after a year in Turkey, Langlands returned as professor at Yale before ending up at the IAS. His travels have made him proficient in French, German, Turkish, and some Russian.
You deliver papers in these languages.
Well, yeah, of course, it's rather affected, but it's an amusement for me.
Langlands has written more than 50 papers, some as long as a book. But actually writing a book?
I'm a man, so to speak, of impulses and beginnings, I believe. And a book is more than an impulse, more than a beginning. I'm afraid, when I look at myself and what I've done, that there's a tendency to give up when I think I see the end. Once I see the end, then interest wanes.
In the mid-1980s, Langlands turned his attention to physics, in particular percolation, what he calls a simple kind of motion of fluids.
It was a change of venue, simply because I was not doing very well I was. I wasn't moving along swimmingly. If you work on a simple problem, but I believe it's simple for 10 years and you don't solve it, then you should just leave whatever you discovered to someone else and move on.
And many mathematicians have worked on Langlands' formulations of a general class field theory, producing some important maths, but no final proof.
And they won't be easy to prove in general.
Do you think you'll get what you want within your lifetime?
No, I would be just happy if I could persuade myself first of all, others afterwards, that this was indeed a promising way to move.
The whole of the Langlands program is a sort of bridge between two very different areas of mathematics, between the number theory on the one side and between representation theory that's on the other. Most of my life has been devoted to bits of the Langlands program.
Richard Taylor, now aged 45, had no doubt he wanted to major in maths when he entered university in Cambridge, England, his birthplace.
I did wonder if I was clever enough to do number theory somehow. It seemed to me to have some of the very cleverest mathematicians, professional mathematicians, working in that area.
And Taylor became one of them. For grad school, he opted to leave England for the US.
Mainly the desire just to travel and see something of the world while I was young and free to do so. And I chose to go to Princeton because I knew there were some wonderful number theorists there.
Including Robert Langlands and Andrew Wiles, Taylor decided to have fellow Briton Wiles as advisor.
He was the one who intimidated me least. The other professors just made me really nervous and made me feel really stupid, but Andrew had the knack of putting me at my ease.
They became an historic partnership. In 1993, Wiles had unveiled with fanfare his proof of Fermat's last theorem, only to have someone find a mistake in his calculations.
He tried to repair it himself, and then at some stage he decided the pressure was getting too much, and out of the blue he phoned me up and said, "Will you come and help?" And of course I was delighted to do that. It's probably the most intense collaboration I've had.
They worked often long distance, since Taylor was, by then, back in England as assistant maths lecturer in Cambridge. Another intense thing was happening in his life. He had just met Shanghai-born Christine Chang, a Harvard maths major, spending her senior year on a scholarship stint at Cambridge.
We probably just saw each other around the math department.
Probably our first date was a walk along the river in Cambridge, very beautiful river, to a little village outside where there's a pub, and we had dinner.
The couple returned to the United States, Christine for grad school at Harvard and Richard for a 6-month sabbatical at Princeton.
It was the same time I was working with Andrew Wiles on finish the proof of Fermat's theorem.
Taylor received the Fermat Prize in 2001.
When I do mathematics, I do it for the beauty of what I'm doing, and one never ceases to be surprised at what does find applications. Many years later, number theory now provides the basis of the way your banking records are kept secure. It also provides the basis for the error-correcting codes that allowed large amounts of data to be sent via satellites and over telephone lines without errors being introduced.
Richard and Christine married in 1995 and moved back to England, where Richard became professor of geometry at Oxford.
Because I was hoping to persuade her to live in England, but after a year she insisted on coming back here to Harvard.
I saw, being a Chinese, I found life in this country much easier. There are a lot more Chinese people here, and it's more open. I mean, there are more Chinese people in the university and out of the university.
Outside the British all stuck up or something.
Thus, in 1996, Taylor came to Harvard University as professor of mathematics. The Taniyama-Shimura conjecture had played a vital role in Taylor's and Wiles' final proof of Fermat's last theorem.
For some time it had been known that how you could get from the sort of symmetries, from the geometry to the prime numbers. Andrew and I, working together, established the first cases of moving in this direction in 2 dimensions. This is called the Shimura-Taniyama conjecture, and then in higher numbers of dimensions, there's this huge panoply of conjectures called the Langlands program.
Taylor focused on what's known as the local Langlands program.
The local Langlands conjectures have 2 sides. On this side, we have a representation of a group. N will be the sort of dimension we're working in. P is a chosen prime number. Local means you fix one prime number instead of looking at all prime numbers at the same time. And on the other side, one looks at representations of something called a Galois group. And as Langlands had foreseen, Michael Harris and I were able to show that these really were the same in some precise correspondence one to the other.
7 years ago, Taylor began one of his greatest achievements to date, proving the Sato-Tate conjecture for elliptic curves with non-integral J variant.
Somehow study this equation, how it behaves with each prime number in turn, and you produce a series of numbers, usually written AP. This is the elliptic curve E. And the Sato-Tate conjecture asks how these numbers will vary as the prime number varies. The answer, which was first seen by Sato and Tate more than 40 years ago, was that you get some sort of squash semicircle.
It was tough. After many years' work,
we decided to write up what we had and publish a rather unsatisfactory conditional result. I'd finished doing that a few weeks earlier, and I was lying in bed one night, waiting to turn off the light and go to sleep. And I suddenly thought some things I had heard in lectures. And the next day I sat down and worked it out, and very quickly I knew I had solved the Sato-Tate conjecture.
That was last year.
What's beautiful about this proof is the long line of argument. It has an aspect that takes the cubic equation and relates it to a modular form, and then takes that modular form and has to produce from that other modular forms so they can work into the work that Langlands had done earlier. That's what one looks for in an advance in mathematics, whole linking of ideas.
It's a very frustrating process. I mean, 90% of the time you get absolutely nowhere, or you're going down dead ends, and you live for the few moments when suddenly everything fits together.
He's a very, very hardworking colleague and very, very honorable person. He's taken on so many graduate students, and he's also the director of our graduate program, so he makes a huge contribution to mathematics in that way.
You get this map to projective space.
Yes.
And you prove that it's independent.
Taiwanese graduate student Lan Kai-wen began working with Taylor in 2004.
He has a lot of knowledge and experience which nobody else really have. Also, he has a very clear way to express those things. So we do have a genuine understanding of those things after he proved it. And I think this is very helpful also for our, say, younger generations like us.
Ooh, you think about it. Oh, you're right. I'm wrong. You're right. Sorry, Chloe.
Richard himself knew he liked maths since age 11.
I was good at it. Occasionally you saw an argument that was so incisive and clear. It had a beauty to it.
His father is a theoretical physicist.
He was a great role model. He taught me never to be satisfied until I'd really understood something. And he also taught me not to be afraid of asking simple-minded questions.
Both his children, Jeremy and Chloe, play the piano.
My mother's a piano teacher, in fact, and when I was little I was pushed to play some sort of musical instrument. If somebody pushes me to do something, I do the opposite. I like things in general where I'm pushing myself and competing against nature.
I've always liked to go into the mountains to test myself against the mountains in the same sort of way I test myself against mathematical problems. And both mathematics and mountaineering are something you do with friends. They're very collaborative activities.
Christine, what is it about Richard that attracted you?
He's quiet and unassuming. He's not showy. He's not the fastest. There are lots of mathematicians who are very quick. He's not an intimidating sort of mathematician.
Christine is in the maths field of evolutionary game theory at Harvard, but they live separate mathematical lives.
He's worried that he would destroy my confidence because he's more successful than I am.
And of the future?
And I can't really imagine moving from Harvard. We both have jobs here, we're settled.